History has a way of repeating itself. With rising inflation, supply chain disruptions, and food shortages, we may soon find ourselves eating the same meals our grandparents did during the Great Depression. They say necessity is the mother of invention, and let me tell you, these folks were geniuses in the kitchen. Simple, no-nonsense dishes that stuck to your ribs and kept you going when times were tough. Right, you lot. First up, we've got Hoover Stew. Picture this: macaroni, canned tomatoes, and hot dogs. You heard me right, hot dogs. Now, I've got nothing against a good frankfurter, but chucking it in a pot with some sad-looking macaroni, that's just taking the piss. This was a meal born out of pure desperation, a last resort when the cupboards were bare and your wallet was thinner than a piece of paper. But here's the kicker: they say this stew could feed a whole family on a shoestring budget. So if you're ever in a right pickle and need to feed the troops on a dime, just remember old Hoover and his sorry excuse for a stew. Next up, we've got dandelion salad. This ain't your delicate farm-to-table greens with artisanal vinaigrette. Back in the Depression, folks were so desperate for a bit of green on their plate that they resorted to foraging for dandelions. You know, those pesky weeds that pop up all over your lawn. Yep. Those were considered a delicacy back then. A little vinegar, maybe some sugar if you were lucky, and bam, you've got yourself a Depression-era salad. All right, you lot, let's talk cornbread and milk. This ain't no fancy dessert. It's a Depression-era staple that kept bellies full when times were tough. Crumble that day-old cornbread right into the milk, let it soak up all that creamy goodness, and boom. You got yourself a hearty, rib-sticking meal. Sure, it ain't the most glamorous dish on the planet, but it's simple, it's cheap, and it'll fill you up. Chapter 4, Lentil Loaf, the Meatless Wonder. This vegetarian wonder was a lifesaver during the Depression, when meat was a luxury few could afford. Forget your fancy Wagyu and Kobe beef, we're talking lentils here. These little legumes were cheap as chips and packed with protein, making them the perfect meat substitute for families struggling to make ends meet. It might not have been a Sunday roast, but it did the bloody job. Chapter 5, Mock Apple Pie. Don't be fooled by the name. This pie is as old school as it gets, a true testament to the ingenuity of Depression-era cooks. Imagine this: apples are scarce, sugar is rationed, but you're craving a taste of something sweet. What do? You fake it. These resourceful bakers used crackers, yes, crackers, as the base for their pie filling. The result, a surprisingly convincing apple pie that fooled even the most discerning palate. Chapter 6, Potato Pancakes, simple yet bloody brilliant. During the Depression, potatoes were a lifeline. These pancakes, made with grated potatoes, flour, and a few basic seasonings, were a staple on many tables. Fried to perfection in a pan with a bit of oil or lard, they offered a comforting and satisfying meal that was both cheap and cheerful. They could be eaten on their own, as a side dish, or even used to mop up the last bits of gravy on your plate. Chapter 7, Peanut Butter and Onion Sandwich, an unlikely duo. This unlikely pairing was surprisingly popular during the Depression, and for good reason. Think about it. Peanut butter, cheap, packed with protein. Onions, pungent, flavorful, and readily available. Put them together, and you've got yourself a surprisingly satisfying sandwich that'll stick to your ribs. It might sound like a culinary abomination, but hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Title: Cabbage Soup, the OG cleanse. Back in the Depression, cabbage was a godsend. This soup, made with cabbage, onions, carrots, and whatever other vegetables were on hand, was a lifesaver. It was simple, it was nutritious, and it could be stretched to feed a crowd. Plus, it tasted bloody good. So, if you're ever feeling under the weather, or just need a break from your extravagant lifestyle, give this humble soup a try. Chapter 9, Depression Cake, Baking Without the Frills. This cake is a testament to the ingenuity of Depression-era bakers who refused to let rationing dampen their spirits. Imagine this: eggs, butter, milk, all scarce and rationed. So what do? You improvise? This ingenious cake gets its moisture from oil, its sweetness from sugar or molasses, and its leavening from baking soda and vinegar. The result, a surprisingly moist and flavorful cake that's perfect for any occasion. It might not be the fanciest cake on the block, but it's a reminder that you can still bake something delicious even when times are tough. Chapter 10, Rice and Raisins, Sweet Simplicity. Think about it. Rice, cheap, filling and easy to cook. Raisins, a touch of sweetness and a good source of energy. Together they make a surprisingly satisfying meal or side dish that won't break the bank. It might not be the most exciting dish on the planet, but it's simple, it's affordable, and it'll fill you up. Chapter 11, Carrot hot dogs, putting on a brave face. Meat was a luxury few could afford, so resourceful cooks turned to vegetables to mimic their favorite dishes. Enter the humble carrot, boiled until tender, then slathered in ketchup and mustard, nestled in a bun pretending to be a hot dog. It might sound utterly bonkers, but hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. And who knows, maybe it's not half bad. Title: Bacon Grease Toast, Waste Not, Want Not. Back then, throwing away perfectly good bacon grease was practically a sin. This liquid gold was carefully saved and used to add flavor and richness to all sorts of dishes, including this humble slice of toast. The rendered fat infused with smoky bacon goodness was spread on bread, adding a savory depth of flavor that elevated this simple dish to new heights. It might sound strange, but trust me, this is one Depression-era hack you'll want to try. Waste not, want not, indeed, not want. Right, you lot, buckle up because we're about to delve into the world of military rations with this one, chipped beef on toast, or as the GIs affectionately called it, SOS. And no, they weren't calling for help. It might not be the most glamorous dish, but it's surprisingly comforting and satisfying, especially on a cold day. Listen up, you lot. We're going back to basics with this one. Boiled onions and mashed potatoes. Onions, cheap and flavorful, were boiled until meltingly tender, while potatoes, filling and versatile, were mashed to creamy perfection. Together they made a humble yet satisfying meal that warmed the soul and filled the belly. It might not be fancy, but it's a reminder that you don't need a lot to create something delicious and comforting. All right, you lot, brace yourselves. This last one's not for the faint of heart. Oatmeal water soup. Imagine this. You've got nothing but a handful of oats and a pot of water. These meager ingredients were simmered together, creating a thin, watery soup that was more about sustenance than satisfaction. It's a stark reminder of the hardships endured and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. These meals, as unappetizing as some may seem today, kept families alive during the Great Depression. With food prices soaring today, we may have to revisit these recipes. Which one would you try? Let me know in the comments below. And remember, even in tough times, there's always a way to put a meal on the table.